hope anybody watching is having an awesome day and are excited to get stuck into this thing. So to give you a little bit of a brief intro to who I am and what I do, my name's Craig Bentick. I'm an independent developer. I've been working in the games industry, between studios and independently for a pretty long time, since the early 2000s. And I am obsessed with VR. It is my jam. I love it. From the point that I got a DK2, I had a friend buy one for me and give it to me as a gift. I've just been obsessed ever since. And so that friend and I developed and released Kingspray Graffiti Simulator for the Oculus Rift, and Vive, obviously. But we were a launch title for the Oculus Touch when those controllers came out. It feels like a very long time ago. So if you're interested, you can go and check that out. We're pretty proud of it, and we continue to work on it and be amazed by the things that people make with it. But with that as a means of establishing some form of bona fides, welcome to what is probably going to be a very scrappy presentation, but I'm going to do my best. So what I thought might be a fun thing to do is to examine a project that should be fairly straightforward to prototype. So when you're starting out in developing games and learning about it and working out how you want to do it, it's a bit daunting to sort of think, I have to create a game that's completely original and is not based on anything else and all of that. The other trap that you can fall into is, I'm just going to make a clone of something that I've played before. Like, I love Castlevania, so I want to make a Castlevania clone. So in this case, I decided to try and take something from the real world and bring that into VR, much in the same way as we did with Kingspray. So today's brief session, we're going to go for about 20 minutes. We're going to keep it short and sharp. Is going to cover developing the concept, working out what I want to achieve, what kind of questions I need to answer before I can get started, as well as I'm going to take you through, I've got some screen capture of me building the first pass of this prototype. Now, as we get into subsequent streams, I think we might go into a longer format, and I'd like to actually do some live builds of things with you to be able to talk you through the process. But for today, we're going to be scrubbing through some video that I've captured of myself doing it, and hopefully not show any incriminating Skype chats. That's my darndest hope. So, as I said, I've chosen to attempt to emulate a real world game because I know that there are really well established rules around bowling. You have a certain number of turns. It's like a turn-based game. I know that you throw the ball. If you hit the pins, you get a score. The intent is that you knock down all of the pins. So even if I did not get to the point where I had all of the more complicated rule sets around bowling, there'd be arcane things that I absolutely have no idea about related to professional bowling, I can mimic that action in a pretty straightforward way. But is that actually a good idea? There are a lot of risks associated with that, because if you get it wrong, somebody who's playing it is going to probably feel that pretty quickly, that it's not feeling right. And I don't necessarily mean things like motion sickness or anything like that. That's another reason why something like bowling, to me, was a good choice, because it requires a little bit of movement in a room scale area. And for those of you that are interested in VR, I assume it's probably most of you, you'll know that you'll have a variety of different experiences, ones that are seated, and even ones that use a gamepad rather than motion controllers, all the way up to the void experiences where they build out a warehouse with a real world space that is represented virtually to the people inside it, and they're wirelessly free to move around and do all that kind of stuff. Well, no. We're going to make a simple bowling prototype that you could play in about a 1.5 to 2 meter squared space. And that's my plan. So my first objective is to make it work in a fundamental way. The secondary motivation that I will have is to figure out how to make it feel like real bowling. And even as I sat down to do this, I thought, that's potentially a risky thing, for reasons that I'll get into later. So where do I actually get started? Well, I'm pretty bad in the sense that I don't often make a concrete plan. In this case, I do have some notes and a plan that I put together, but I can't recommend that to anyone who's wanting to get into development. Like, start with a plan, write your stuff down. So I started with research, and I created a mind map. So actually, I'm going to switch over to the video now and see if I can't scrub through. So I kicked off, I was making the project, but then I decided to get into actually doing some research, and I'll just adjust this a little bit so that we can see. So I started by Googling things that I knew I needed to know, like what is the size of a bowling ball? Like what is its actual diameter? How much does it weigh? How big are the lanes in bowling? And there was something that I realized when I started to do my research, which is that Google provides a bunch of, like here, how long is a bowling lane and wide? How long is a bowling lane and wide? So awesome syntax there from whoever's written that question. But there are associated frequently asked questions that come along with it. And that started to inform things that I didn't realize about bowling that I might have to think about, like urethane. What is the ball made of? What kind of material is it that allows a ball to spin and slide on the alley, yet still have enough traction for bowlers to be able to impart spin and do curvy bowls and things like that? I didn't really care about how much it cost to have a bowling lane in the house, but I started to go through and look at different websites and find things. Oh, the worst thing of all, seriously folks, like if you can ever wave a flag for changing everything to be metric instead of imperial, that would be just such an awesome thing, because I've had to sit there on the Google thing changing, what is 14 pounds? Okay, that's it's about 6.5 kilograms. Okay, then the lane widths and dimensions were all in feet and inches and things like that. So, you know, plenty of research going on, and I eventually landed on this image here, which had the dimensions of the bowling lane in meters. And the picture itself is not to scale, but I was really puzzled by some of the numbers that came from that. So if we switch back to the presentation, let me get back here. I've actually skipped a bit here. I want to jump back to the mind maps if I can. So this is a mind map. This is one that I created for this project, and it was purely with the assumption that I'm going to be building a minimum proof of concept. And when we talk about a proof of concept, we're saying, okay, I have an idea, I have a hypothesis for it. It's kind of a little bit like the scientific method. How am I going to prove or disprove my idea that, let's say, I can build a basic bowling mechanic? So the first questions that I asked myself, and speaking about mind maps, God, I'm all over the shop here. Let's talk about them. It's a method that I use to lay out my ideas in what I call a nonlinear fashion. So I can create a high-level topic, like what questions do I need to answer? And then from that, I can have hanging off it those questions. And then from those questions, I can have a variety of answers or details or little notes that I want to make. It's the same way that most people will use a notepad when they're writing their ideas down. But for me, I have brain explosions. They happen quickly. They're kind of, I feel like there's a little bit of Doc Brown in my brain. For anyone who remembers Back to the Future. Of course you do. You know what I'm talking about. I need to get all of that stuff out of my head as quickly as possible. And I'm not penalized by going down one particular tangent too far. So I'm talking here about lopsided maps. And that would be where I have, like you'll see in this, it's pretty balanced. You know, there's a range of topics that I've got, and they have little subtopics coming off them. But normally when I'm having an idea, there'll be one of these that has like a gigantic mass of stuff that's like dangling off here because it caught in my brain when I was thinking about it. And I've, you know, taken that concept from, oh, I wonder if it'd be fun to do X, all the way through to, this thing will be the be-all and end-all of everything. Look at how many ways I could use it and how exciting it could be. Here are all the scenarios the player could use a thing, or, you know, those unraveling ideas will create a bit of a lopsided look. But what was I rabbiting on about here? Right, so the fact that I've captured my brain explosion, it's very natural to me and much easier for me to do than sit down with a pen and paper and try and write it down in a linear way where I have to be like, have one topic, I'm going to address everything to do with that, then I'm going to move on to the next topic. I know that that's not how my brain operates, so I have to catch everything as quickly as I can and have it in some format that's kind of still digestible. So I went into my research. I've already shown you some of that stuff, asking some basic questions and the length and width of the standard lanes. And then I started to actually think, all right, I don't need to know this stuff right now, but in terms of the rules of the game, are there things that I need to be aware of before I start building any of the functionality for the prototype? Like, you know, about splits and, you know, how many frames are played, that kind of a thing. A lot of those things turned out to be not as relevant to me at this point, and they're things that I address later on. But as I said, that searching that I was doing, I started searching based upon other people's queries, because I felt like it will inform me better that there are people who are genuinely interested in bowling, who have an interest in it and want to ask these questions, rather than me fumbling around trying to figure out what kind of question I'd need to ask. So I found that really helpful. Right, so back to the mind map. So I started to map this stuff out, right? And some of the questions that I asked were, how sophisticated does this project need to be? Does it need to be super accurate? Does it have to have professional voice acting? Does it have to have a ton of animation? You know, what kind of compromises can I make when I'm starting to build this in order to answer the question I started with, that hypothesis, and defining those questions? What unknowns about this am I trying to understand? So one of the other reasons that you build a proof of concept is to not only prove that it can be done and prove that you can do it, let's say, or prove that it's fun, but identify what kind of risks might come out of it. And that's something that I'm going to talk about in a minute, because there are risks that popped up in this to me as I was building it that I had not accounted for. So doing this quick and dirty, rough proof of concept is definitely something that I would recommend, because I benefit from it every single time. There's always something that you learn. Even if you've done the same activity a number of times, there will always be an aspect of it that you can iterate or improve on or learn more about or make fit your purpose in this context, in this project, a little bit better. So I started off with things like the bowling action. So I want to grab the ball, I want to be able to throw it, and I want to be able to spin it to knock down the pins. So I start to flesh out some other ideas, and these are things that kind of entered in later, which we'll see as I go through the video stuff. So I started to flesh out notions like simple and complex bowling. So I would start with a simplified model and then move on to something that was more complex if I needed it. So things like taking advantage of the physics system within the engine and bending it more to my will than what it might do normally. So basically I'm saying, do I want to fake elements of the throw that the player is making? And this is a really interesting thing we'll get into, because we are using motion controllers. It's not like you're pressing down a button and releasing it when a bar hits a certain point and it's going to throw the ball exactly where the game intends you to throw it. It is absolutely tied to an analog of your real world presence. And that does add in some extra layers of complexity. So prototyping. So it's the first step. How do I start? What do I want to do? Well, I decided that I was going to start from a template that's provided with the Unreal Engine that has some basic functionality in it, but I also knew that I was going to have to do 3 or 4 things straight away, because I've used this template before. I know I need to tear that out, I need to replace that. I use my own solution for this. Bing, bang, boom. All right, let's get to a baseline and I can start actually thinking about the bowling aspect of it. So I'm just going to quickly scrub through this video and give you a look. So actually the first thing that I ended up doing was doing some modeling. So I started to build the lane that we're going to bowl down, looking at the dimensions of it and going, okay, it's 18 meters long and it's 1.05 meters wide. Now, I don't know about you, but when I see this and it says that a bowling lane is 1 meter wide, that blows my mind a little bit. And the crazy narrowness and length of the box that I created in my art package, I'm using 3ds Max here, kind of puzzled me straight away. And so in this footage, you can see that I'm constantly going back and forth and checking my math and going, well, how could that possibly be right? And that was indeed borne out when I took it into the engine. So I think if we jump ahead, you'll see that I've brought it in here into the engine. I'm just setting up some elements here. So, right, here we go. This is my first test that I did of looking down the lane, and it was pretty mental, because I was just like, this lane is too small. So I had to go back and look at these elements and double check it and all of that kind of stuff. But then I went, you know what, whatever. I'm going to trust the numbers that they've given me and work on things like the ball itself. So, you know, creating a ball, bringing that into the engine. And so here I'm using the blueprint visual programming system inside of Unreal. I totally lost the ability to say words just then. It's a node-based programming tool, effectively, so we can do things like... okay. Craig's forgotten how to talk. Let's hit the reset button. Blueprints are so awesome that I would talk for days and days and days and days about them. In fact, I do, because it's my job. I'm a teacher, and I love sharing this stuff with people because they are a method for folks who maybe aren't as technical, like designers or artists or folks like that, to get into programming and creating their own functionality and doing things like this and prototyping their own game. So I've gone in and created a ball. What you saw in this blueprint here is a really basic grab and drop system. So I'm able to attach the ball to my hand effectively, and then when I release a trigger, it's going to drop that object. It's going to release it. So that's fine. That's perfectly good for my testing. So we'll see what that looks like. I've got all my spheres here. I've got my player already set up, and right, okay, cool. I reach over, I grab it, cool, I've got it, I let go of it. Whoop, hello, what's going on there? When I release it, it's just sitting in the air. It's not doing anything. Now, why could that be? Well, I know why that was, and it's because I was not simulating physics on that object. So it was sitting there, it was getting grabbed, it was quite happy to do that, but as soon as I let go of it, it had its physics simulation turned off, and so it would remain rigid in the air, which is fine. I can accommodate that. So I'm jumping through and fixing that stuff up, right? And then I'm pretty sure, if I'm not massively mistaken, that I've got the step here where I can grab it. No, I guess I hadn't fixed it at that point. Let's jump back in. Let's see what we got going on there. Aha. Okay, cool. All right, so I think this is where we've got it working. So I can grab it. No, still not. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So I can grab it. No. Wow, this is making me... Oh, right. Okay, so this is the next step. I honestly had forgotten this step was in here, and this is pretty cool. So I decided that I had a problem, which was that I can reach out for these items on the bench, but they have to really be within my hand's grasp. I really have to basically put my hand through these objects in order to pick them up. And that's not my favorite thing in the world, and it's certainly not massively user-friendly for people who might not be super used to VR. They might not want to move around too much. They don't want to have to reach across the room and put their hand through their wall in order to pick up this ball. So what I did was I implemented what I'm calling a Jedi grab, wherein, and this pattern that you see me putting together here is a really common one. I'm using a trace, a volume trace. So I think it's a sphere trace in this case, that is an invisible shape that's going to extend out in front of my hand and detect any objects that are in front of me. So it really is like having the Force. And if it does detect an object, and that object meets certain conditions, like it's able to be picked up, however I want to define that particular condition, I can check against that. And if I do that, then straight away, hopefully this will come through okay. I've got my headset on, I'm doing my testing. You can see that there's the capsule shape that's extending out from my hand that is turning green and putting a little dot there where it's hitting the ball, and then I can grab it from that distance. So I can grab it like with a laser and throw it around and do all of that great stuff. Oh, hey, well, I don't think that was a strike, but it could have been close. But, I've still got the problem that even with that extended grab, which I set to be, I think, 1.5 meters, there's still stuff that's going to be out of reach. So I'm going to have to accommodate that at some point. But right now, I've got my ability to grab the ball, and I've got my ability to release it and have it subject to physics. Okay, cool. So I jump into my mind map at this point and I say, all right, it's great that I can grab it from a distance, but I actually want the ball to snap to the player's hand when they grab it rather than being off in the distance. So if I were to grab it now, as you saw in the video, it's offset at a distance, and that's not really a good bowling action. So at this stage, this is where I decided to implement my more complex grabbing that I listed in the mind map earlier, wherein rather than using a direct attachment, so if you think about a piece of Lego that is snapped onto another piece of Lego, that's what I would consider to be a very rigid attachment. Now, the problem with that is that once you do that kind of rigid attachment, you are no longer subjecting things to physics. So I would be able to grab a ball and stick it through a wall and it would not bounce back or anything. It would let me do anything I wanted to as far as collision goes. What I'm doing here is that I'm setting up a physical grab that's going to snap to the player's hand, but also allow me to have the ball interact with the world around me and not just pass through things like a ghost. So I've got my snapping enabled, and I'm using a separate attachment point on it. So I've just added another, like there's an arrow, this little red bit here that I've attached to the object, and I can use the position of that arrow relative to the ball itself to work out where I want it to snap to on the hand. So I've got the hand's position and I've got the arrow's position. So that's where I want a person to grab the ball, and I can just snap those two things together. So that works out pretty nicely. All right, okay, so here's the point where I went, oh gosh, okay, I've got my grabbing and everything working, but now I actually want to make this somewhat pretty because my balls just look like grey horribleness. So this is an example of using the material editor inside of Unreal, and this is a method that we use to combine mathematical formulas and images as textures to create the appearance of a real world surface or a stylized surface, whatever you happen to want to be creating. So in this context, I've created my ball, I've given it some mapping coordinates, and I'm setting this up in a way that I can modulate the color of the ball. And what I've also done here, which is probably not immediately apparent, is that I've animated the textures on the ball. So I'm just using a basic cloudy noise texture that's going to scroll around the ball and give the appearance of that underlying, I want to call it like a pearlescent effect that you get from a lot of bowling balls. I'd have to actually look into how they're made, but I can tell you that this is an effective method for that. Hello? Oh man, seriously, got a phone call from someone. I don't know where they're calling from. That was rude. Sorry about that, folks. Yes, so the example I'm giving here, I'm creating the cloudy material for the bowling ball, and boom, we can see that they've all got that wonderful bounciness to them and the good look. Okay, so let's switch over. What have we got in our presentation so far? Are we moving on? Yep, talking about that, modeling placeholder assets, my concerns about the sizes. Right, okay, so my hypothesis with the lane was that I think it's a matter of perspective. Usually when we're in a bowling alley, there are a lot of lanes, stacked from side to side, and we're looking down the length of that lane. We're looking at a distant group of pins, and so we're standing right on top of it, whereas everything that I'm looking at is, a bird's eye view. I'm kind of considering it from a distance. We're not outside the bowling alley looking in through an invisible roof to see it. I'm just going to go with that for the moment. I'm going to trust the numbers that the real world bowling system gave me. So at this point, I've gone through and I've loaded up a bunch of balls ready to be grabbed and thrown. They've got their material on them. I'm creating a little run to hold them so that it kind of caps things off a little bit and I don't lose them. There's a predictable area that I'm going to have some balls in. Once I've done that, what am I doing here? I'm in the ball itself. Right, so actually, this is where I've gone through and created that physical grab. And I'm pretty sure that we'll have an example of that now. I'll just play this back. Right, okay, so, right, when I grab it, I can grab it, and I think you hopefully can see that it's colliding with my hand at that point. So there's collision geometry on the hand mesh itself, and the ball was colliding with it. But I have a problem now, which is that when I release it, it's not releasing the physical constraint that I created for that ball. So that's an adjustment that has to be made to that template, where generally it'll check for whether or not that object is parented to the motion controller, and that is just bad. That's no, thank you. No, that's not good. So I always tear that out as soon as I start a project because it just doesn't work for me. That's not how I grab things. So right, I can grab it and I can release it. I've got a little bit of a problem with it colliding with the hand and the positioning and whatnot, because in the last one I had that offset that was putting the ball in a comfortable position with that red arrow. Well, now I don't necessarily have that offset because I've completely changed the way the grabbing works. So to put it in really basic terms, I have a data type that I can switch inside of this blueprint that says, am I a snap attach rigid connection like the original one that we had earlier where I was picking it up and it was just snapped, like I said, it can't collide, or do I want to do a handle-based physics grab? And I want to do a handle-based physics grab. So when you do that, it's like adding a little rubber band into the world between whatever you want to control an object and whatever you want to be grabbed by it. And so you can grab and release things. It's a really cool system. So, but I use that for tons and tons of the grabbing stuff in VR because it affords a pretty decent sense of presence for the objects that you're touching. Like, what's the term I'm looking for? Like, as soon as you grab something and you stick it through a wall, you know you're in a simulation. Now, you know you're in a simulation anyway, but any affordance that I can make, both in terms of the reality of that kind of interaction, and indeed because I'm wanting to simulate a physical activity like bowling, where the user is going to impart force and spin to the object, I definitely want to be using a properly physical system to do that. I could get away with just having it detach, but I know that I'm going to need to have more control over it than that. So, got my balls going, I'm throwing them, that's great. Let's find something else exciting. Here we go. So I realized that I was running out of balls when I was bowling. And so I elected to create a big, giant, friendly button in the world that would let me do stuff. So right now, what I've placed in that world is a completely generic button. It has a reference in it to another actor in the scene, and it could be anything. It could be a light switch, it could be another character, it could be a particle system, anything at all. In this case, I'm going to use it with a spawner that I create for the bowling balls. Let's see what that's like. Okay, right, so I can grab the ball and I can operate it, and then when I activate that button, I've got a bit of visual feedback so that I know that I've actively, made it do a thing. So that's great. That's a generic button. I could use that for a quintillion different things. The other thing potentially to note about that button is that in terms of the underlying functionality that's being used, it's using the exact same messaging system that I'm using to grab the balls. So the way that works is that my player actor is sending a message to the hands saying, grab something. And then the hands will go, I'll see if I can grab something. And if I can grab something, I'm going to tell that thing, in this case, the ball or the button, to, quote, be grabbed. And the reason that I mention this is that I found it a really enlightening and very positive shift in the way that I was approaching things, that I started to realize, it was something I had to overcome when I was learning about programming, that sometimes an object like a ball is best served, or ball's maybe not the best example, but objects are best served by being responsible for their own operation and responding to external things. So in this case, the ball is responding to my request for it to be grabbed. And it internally, with that physics handle I talked about, or the snapping that we had and all of that stuff, it's internally responsible for handling everything to do with its being grabbed and dropped. That's good, because then your hand can just be sending generic messages out into the world, and if something can respond to it, it'll do that. But if it can't, well, no harm, no foul. The game itself is not going to break. Things are not going to crash. So once I got through that, what did I jump through here? Right, this is the spawner. So it's basically just hooked into that button. The button's going to find it, send it the equivalent of a grab message. And I'm pretty sure, here we go. Right, I'll just skip to where it was completed. Come on. There we go. All right, so now I can pick up and throw the balls, but if I hit that, it's going to spawn some balls in the run for me. Now, it's not perfect. They're kind of falling off and stuff, but I can go absolutely crazy and have all the balls in the world. Yes. And this is where I was starting to think, okay, this is kind of fun. But then I hit another problem, which is that if I've got a ball grabbed with one hand and I grab it with the other, it doesn't really work. Those constraints that I created, the handles, weren't getting cleared up, and so the ball would just be stuck in the air to an invisible spring, which was not ideal. So I blast through and I fix that stuff up. Let's scrub to where something more exciting is happening. I think I fixed that stuff up. Right, cool. So I made some adjustments to the platform that the balls came down on so that I had a more reliable run. And when I create them, they'll play nice. What else we got there? Right, so I made some adjustments, moved the button over, that kind of thing. Let's see, where are we getting to? Right. Oh, this stuff. Yeah, you better believe it. Okay, so I made some changes to the balls here. This big long process of, setting up the material in the first place meant that I was able to, as we see here, in the ball, I'm making it responsible for modulating things like the color and the brightness of the ball that gets generated. So I'll never know precisely which color or what effect is going to be on one of these bowling balls when I spawn it, but it means that they'll all look different. So with just a few nodes and a tiny little bit of adjustment, I've now got effectively an infinite number of different colored balls and a huge variety of visual interest just out of one asset. Now, none of this is meant to look good, and this was kind of a side hatch little furphy for me because I enjoy taking something really simple and throwing something else relatively simple on it to get kind of a cool result and feel like I've got a lot of variety. It's another one of those ways in which we can keep the development of things interesting for ourselves going through without compromising on, the simplicity of a proof of concept. So where did I land up? Right, okay, so the last thing that I'll talk about before we jump into the live demo of where it's at right now is to give you an idea of how I was setting up the pins. So all right, I've got a ball, I can throw it, and now I need to create some pins. How am I going to do that, right? So I made a mesh in my external art application, brought that in, set up some collision for it here inside of the static mesh editor in Unreal, and then set them up in the world, subject them to physics, and now I guess we'll see how this goes. All right, so I've got my helmet on, I've got my orange ball. What am I going to get? All right, I completely missed. All right, so that's suggesting to me there might be a little bit of a problem with the throwing, but I'm not really bowling it per se. I'm piffing it. I'm throwing it like overhand. So I'm not really embracing the notion of bowling, but I got a strike, and that felt good. So that was my excitement of the day, and I did a slow-mo replay. Look at that. Whoa. Brrr. They all came tumbling down. Wonderful. They gave me good feels, and I was excited. So, congratulations, me. Now, what I will show you is, let's have another quick look at that mind map before we start to wrap things up, because I suspect I might be going, I'm already over time now. But let's have a look at what my plan for the pins were. And this is something that I've done subsequently and was not a part of those video clips, but the way that I know I need to handle these pins is that they, just like the ball, are going to be responsible for their own state and their own tracking of whether or not they've been knocked over. I don't want to have a system that's predicated on a whole bunch of intertwined things, right? When I make things, I really like to make them as kind of generic as possible because it gives me flexibility to reuse that stuff elsewhere, but also I think, in my experience, gives me the ability to fundamentally change the way certain things work without affecting a whole bunch of other systems. It's kind of like doing surgery. If I decided the pins or the balls needed to behave very differently, I could make those changes to those things without necessarily affecting the rest of the game if they're not massively related. So the pins tracking whether they're upright, there's vector math that has to be done in there, which I did and had to track and went through a whole debugging process because it's a simple piece of math, but I come from a design and an art background, so math has never been my strong suit. So that's one of those things where, I knew it was a risk going in. That's why it was a part of this plan that I created, that they need to know at a given interval, they need to be checking whether or not they are still upright or whether they have been knocked over, because I'm subjecting the whole thing to physics anyway. And the way that a real bowling lane would do it is that the pins that aren't knocked over get grabbed by that like munchy machine thing that comes down and grabs them, and they sweep all the old ones away and put the, you know, legitimate ones back down, and they're still there. For me, that's not necessarily going to work, because that's a mechanically complicated system in terms of what I can do inside of a game engine compared to the real world. The real world has limitations that I don't have. They can't magically say, you know, pin, now you're self-aware and you know if you're upright or not. And if you're upright, you're going to broadcast that you're upright. If you get knocked over, you're going to broadcast that you're knocked over. That kind of a thing. You know, we don't have sentient bowling pins that will scream and make us aware when they're knocked over. And I think that's a problem. So maybe we'll start a GoFundMe for sentient pins. But I'm hopefully still got some folks on board, and I'll give you a look at where we've landed with this. So there's a few more steps that I've gone through since the videos that I was showing, but I'll crack this open and give you a look. So, all right, hopefully you can see that okay. No, you can't. I have to switch back over. Give me that one. Yes, there we go. All right, so a couple of things to note. One is that I've improved the lanes and I've put gutters on either side. You can't really see it too well here, but they're, you know, gutters that the ball can fall into. There's no special system handling returning the balls or anything at this point. And if I do end up doing that, it'll probably be a mainly cosmetic thing, because I have the capability to spawn a new ball here anyway. And certainly while I'm developing a proof of concept, I don't need to worry about that kind of immersion. The other thing that you might notice is that I've got these weird pink beams coming out of my hands. And what is that all about? Well, that is to give the user some visual feedback about the distance that their Jedi grab is going to reach. So right now it's turned on all the time. Realistically, it should only really turn on when I, you know, point at something or I grab it. But what you hopefully can see is that it's modulating its distance and scaling itself based upon my proximity to the thing that I want to grab or use. And it's only going to do that for things that can be used. So that's cool. The other thing that's in here now, just for the sake of my own debugging and development and progress, is that I have smooth locomotion. So I can walk around using the thumbstick on one of my controllers, and I can walk around and I can move around the space, which is kind of, you know, it's something that I definitely want to give the players in the final product, I think, but it's also largely just for me to be able to move around this space and do stuff and handle things when they happen. The other is that I have snap turning on the other stick, so I can change my orientation, and when I use the other stick, I'm going to move in the direction that I'm facing, and that's all good. So this is something that you'll see is pretty standard in a lot of VR games. People argue about what kind of locomotion methods are best. For me, the best one is the one that doesn't make me feel sick, but I've got an iron stomach now, so that's kind of hard to quantify, and that matches the gameplay. Like, a lot of people don't realize, when you're designing a game, you build it around something like a locomotion system. How fast can I move? Can I walk around? Can I spin around? All of these things, they inform the design of the rest of the game, the player's capabilities. And so when people come along and say, oh, you should have like rocket pack, like super jump things in this VR game because I want it. Oh, smooth locomotion please, we hate teleporting. That's fine, totally valid criticism, but the developers of that game will have made a specific choice to say, we are going to support only teleporting, or we're only going to support, you know, ghost movement, or whatever the case may be. All right, rant off. What else have we got going on here? Right, okay, so I've got myself a ball. Now I've made some adjustments to the throwing action off screen, where I've been modulating the weight of the ball a little bit to try and get its behavior feeling good. But what I realized is I'm incredibly lazy. And like you would have noticed in the other videos that I'm grabbing a bowling ball, I'm just waving it around all over the place. There's no sense of weight to this. This is basically, the ball is as heavy as the motion controller that I'm holding is, which is not terribly heavy. So the idea that I can bowl effectively, well actually that wasn't too bad, but I've been practicing, means that there are some accommodations and indeed some cheats that I need to make in order to make it feel good. So for instance, the first one is going to be that I like to go sideways and I like to bowl this way, but that's because I'm sitting down in front of a computer. The problem that I have at the moment is that I'm not testing this standing up. I'm not actually engaging in the physical activity. So any data that I get from my testing, or any decisions that I make, are going to be largely based upon what's comfortable for me sitting in a chair. No, that's not going to go anywhere. No, that's not going to go anywhere. No, spin's not working. Oh man, I keep going to the left. Oh, come on, just give me one. Oh man, seriously? Alright, I'm just going overhand. Nope, that's not working either. The man cannot bowl. Worst demo ever. Alright, so I'll give you another example. So right now you can see that there's like a green line coming off of my ball. I implemented a separate mode for this, where if I'm holding a ball and I hold down the trigger, everything goes into crazy bullet time, and then when I release it, it's imparting a false force onto the ball. So it's doing some and the reason that it looks kind of janky at the moment is because I'm doing a lot of calculations at the moment about its velocity and trajectory and things like that, in order to work out how to fake what I think the user wants to do. And that comes down to, like I said, the fact that we're not actually holding a real bowling ball, and they are like 6 kilograms. These controllers are not 6 kilograms. The other thing to take into consideration is that the center of mass, and the fulcrum that I'm trying to throw it from, right? So Archimedes, give me a lever and a fulcrum, I can move the earth, that whole thing, is not imparting the force in quite the right way. So I'm having to do some calculations and some math behind the scene to track how fast this thing is moving over time, as well as when the user is releasing that control. Because we've got an analog control, a 0 to 1 range on something like a grip or a trigger, and we have to determine, well, do we actually have the ball get released as soon as the grip is less than 100%? Or do we wait until the grip is less than 25% or 50% before we actually let it go? And for the most part, if you're just picking an object up and then immediately dropping it, you won't notice that. But if you're trying to throw it, the arc of that throw, we're using the base of our wrist to give it that angular momentum as well. There's a whole lot of stuff involved in, and I think that's why I wanted to mention those risks and the unknowns. That I sat down and I went, this is going to be a piece of cake. You know, I'm just grabbing a ball and I'm throwing it. All right, that's fine. I can do that. Oh, come on, let me hit one pin. Oh, see, I'm in my head now. I'm too in my head. There we go. Boom. And what you may notice is that those pins are turning red, and they disappear when they get knocked down. And that's part of my frame reset for the pins. Oh, 2 more. There we go. All right, let's see if I can get it. Ooh, and you also notice that when I activate that, it's a slow-mo trajectory mode, that it's also turning on the emissive illumination for the balls, so they glow like you're giving them an extra boost of power. So a nice red ball. Well, it changes the color also, I guess, as well. Oh, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on. Oh! Right, now actually this is perfect. So you may see that that pin is canted over, but it has not completely fallen over. It has not turned red, and if I want to bowl again, in terms of the rules of the game, that pin needs to be upright. So I've implemented this other button. So this is the one that spawns my balls, but this button over here is going to reset any of the pins that are left in the frame. Now right now I'm doing that with a button, and that's fine, but as I go forward into building the rest of the game framework, that will happen when the player takes a turn, then it'll reset it, player takes another turn, and it'll calculate their final score, and then completely reset the whole frame for the next player to come along. What else is there? So there's actually a cheeky little side hatch nonsense thing that I did, and it was part of the mind map, and I'll show it to you. As I was thinking about the complex bowling, I started to think about gravity bowling, and that I think is potentially a trajectory that I'm going to go down with this project. I may well have started out trying to create a realistic simulation of what bowling is like, but what often happens in design is that through the process of doing this, you discover something that is potentially way cooler or more interesting, or, you know, potentially alleviates issues that might exist in recreating the real world one. And so I'll wrap things up by going back to my wonderful presentation for just a fraction of a second. And I'm going to scram right through the measurements. So there's a disconnect between what I expect and what the reality is. Now, if I made a choice at this point about something like the lane width to change that so that it matched more with what my expectations were and potentially what, you know, a wide range of players' expectations would be, that's opening a door, right? In terms of the rules of my design, I can now say, well, all right, if the lane is going to be wider, then maybe the balls can be heavier, or, you know, maybe the pins are upside down, they're in a circle or something, different geometries of pin that I could use, things like that. So it's kind of cracking open that door to the harebrained scheme of something like gravity bowling, where we're going to have kind of black holes that run from where the player is down to where the pins are, and they're actually going to potentially use like gravity wells to try and orbit their ball into where it needs to be. It's not a fully formed concept in my head, but if I want to end up going there, then I can forgive myself for making these changes. The rules that I make, they're not necessarily set in stone, but I'm giving myself an opportunity to be more forgiving with my design and embrace those discoveries as they come along. I do very much hope that this was interesting, compelling, and not entirely broken for you folks. I am looking to return. I'm not sure if it's going to be next week, or we'll have to figure out precisely when the dates are, but my inclination is with the next presentation, I actually want to be working in the engine. I don't want to be scrubbing through these videos and showing you little thumbnails of things. I think we will pick a specific task that we want to complete in a session, and I will walk you through my process for solving that problem and hopefully take on some suggestions and feedback along the way. I'm totally going to wrap up now because I'm way over time. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for being here, and I'm going to very gracelessly end the stream now. If you want more information on AIE and our courses, I teach for the online campus, by the way. So you'd think that I'd be less scrappy at streaming, but I guess I'm having one of those days. It's Friday, and I'm talking about a thing that I'm kind of passionate about. So make sure to check out the details, and have a good one, and I'll catch you next time.